There's a moment in Solo Leveling, and if you've read it, you know the one, where Sung Jin Woo stops being afraid. Not because he gets stronger, not because he finds allies, or a reason or a revelation. He simply stops registering fear. And the show frames this as a triumph. His face is calm, his posture steady. The system pings, numbers rise. He moves forward into the dark. But if you handed that same behavioral profile to a clinical psychologist, the emotional blunting, the detachment from mortal danger, the collapse of normal fear responses, they wouldn't call it growth. They'd call it dissociation. Today, we're not going to talk about Sung Jin Woo's power level. We're going to talk about his mind. Specifically, we're going to examine how Solo Leveling, intentionally or not, maps one of the most psychologically rich trauma responses in clinical literature onto its protagonist's entire character arc. This is going to get a little uncomfortable. That's the point. Segment 2. Establishing the lens. Before we go further, let's establish our framework, because dissociation is one of the most misunderstood terms in popular psychology. When most people hear it, they imagine amnesia. The dramatic movie version, you wake up and you don't know who you are. That's the extreme end. Clinically, dissociation exists on a spectrum. At its mildest, it's highway hypnosis. You've been driving for 40 minutes and your conscious mind wasn't really there. At its most severe, it fractures identity entirely. But in the middle of that spectrum, where Sung Jin Woo lives, dissociation looks like this: a persistent sense of emotional distance from your own experience, the ability to move through extreme danger without the physiological panic that should accompany it, a feeling of watching yourself from the outside, performing actions without fully inhabiting them, and critically, a narrowing of self down to function, down to task completion, down to survival. The American Psychiatric Association describes this as depersonalization, a detachment from one's sense of self, and derealization, where the external world feels unreal, processed at a remove. Now, reread Jinwoo's internal monologue across the first half of the series with that vocabulary in your head. It reads very differently. Segment 3. The Double Dungeon. Ground Zero. Everything begins in the Double Dungeon, the setup for anyone who needs the recap. Jinwoo and a raiding party discover a second dungeon hidden inside the first. They're trapped. The statues demand ritual. People begin dying in ways that are specific, targeted, and grotesque. Jinwoo doesn't just survive this. He witnesses mass death, suffers catastrophic physical trauma, effectively dying himself, and is then selected by a supernatural system and resurrected into a new mode of existence. Now, here's what I want you to notice about how the narrative handles the psychological aftermath of this event. It doesn't. There is no processing. There is no grief sequence. There is no scene where Jinwoo sits with the weight of what happened to him. The story moves forward because the system moves forward, and Jinwoo moves with it because the system gives him something extraordinary in the wake of overwhelming trauma. It gives him tasks, objectives, measurable progress, a daily quest log, a numerical system that converts his suffering into legible, gameable metrics. In trauma psychology, this is a recognizable adaptive behavior. When the emotional reality of an experience is too large to process, the mind often retreats into what's sometimes called task mode, hyper-focusing on actionable, controllable elements as a way of structuring an unstructured catastrophe. The system, narratively speaking, is Jinwoo's dissociation made external. It literalizes his psychological retreat into a fantasy of measurable control, and the story rewards him for it, enormously. This is where solo leveling becomes genuinely interesting as a text rather than simply as entertainment. Segment 4. The Architecture of Avoidance. Let's talk about what Jinwoo doesn't do across the story's runtime. He doesn't maintain meaningful friendships. The relationships he has, with Jinho, with other hunters, are warm on the surface, but notice how Jinwoo consistently positions himself outside the emotional register of these connections. He's kind, he's loyal in action, but he's not present the way someone who is psychologically integrated is present. He doesn't grieve his dead comrades from the double dungeon, not in any visible, narratively developed way. He doesn't talk about fear, even when he encounters enemies that should terrify him, monarchs, beings of cosmic scale. His internal voice doesn't spike with panic. It assesses, it calculates, it strategizes, and perhaps most tellingly, he pursues power not with joy or ambition or hunger, but with something closer to compulsion. There's a flatness to it, a driven, relentless, joyless efficiency. Psychologists studying trauma survivors often describe a behavioral pattern called hyperactivation of the task self, where an individual substitutes goal-directed behavior for emotional processing. The goals become, in essence, the entire personality. Sound familiar? Jinwoo's power progression is canonically framed as remarkable in-universe, specifically because of how single-minded it is. Other hunters don't train this way. Other hunters can't train this way. And the implication in the narrative is that this makes him exceptional. But the question worth sitting with is, what does it cost him? Segment 5. The Shadow Army. Externalizing the inner world. Here's where the literary analysis gets particularly rich. Jinwoo's core power isn't just strength or speed. It's the ability to raise the dead as shadows, to extract the defeated and make them his soldiers, his companions, his subjects. On the surface, this is a very cool superpower. Underneath, it's a perfect psychological metaphor. Think about what Jinwoo is doing symbolically every time he raises a shadow. He is taking something that tried to destroy him, that nearly killed him, and he is subordinating it, reordering it, making it serve him, converting a source of terror into a source of power. In trauma psychology, there's a concept called integration, the process of taking fragmented, overwhelming traumatic memories and weaving them into a coherent, manageable narrative. The goal of integration is to make the traumatic event part of your story rather than the thing that keeps overwriting your story. Jinwoo never does this emotionally, but he does it literally. His shadow army is a physical enactment of integration that bypasses the emotional requirement. He doesn't have to feel his fear of Egris. He just makes Egris kneel. He doesn't have to process the horror of the Ant King. He just makes Beru his most loyal general. There's even something poignant and deeply sad in how Jinwoo relates to his shadows. They're his closest companions. He names them. He notices their quirks, Beru's protectiveness, Egris's dignity. These shadows are, in a very real sense, his only intimate relationships. And they cannot leave him. They cannot die permanently. They cannot disappoint him, betray him, or fail to understand him. They are, essentially, the one form of connection that a dissociated person can fully trust, one that cannot generate new trauma. Segment 6. The mother scene, a crack in the armor. There's one sequence in the story that I think is the emotional key to everything we've been building, and it's deliberately understated, which makes it easy to miss. When Jinwoo's mother is ill, when she's hospitalized, when her condition deteriorates, watch what Jinwoo does. He goes hunting. He levels up. He pushes harder. He doesn't sit with her. Not really. Not for long. He acquires, he sprints toward, the means to save her. He finds a way to apply power to the problem, and he does it with the same flat intensity he brings to every dungeon. And when he succeeds, when he acquires the means to heal her, the narrative doesn't linger on their reunion. It doesn't give us the catharsis of a son who has reconnected with his mother through sustained presence and vulnerability. It gives us a transaction, a solution, a completed quest. This is not a criticism of the writing. I want to be precise here. I think this is the writing working exactly as intended, even if the author didn't consciously theorize it this way. Because what that scene reveals is that Jinwoo's love for his mother, which is real and deep, can only express itself through doing, through action, through the acquisition of solutions. He cannot sit in the feeling of almost losing her. So he removes the condition that generated the feeling. That is a very human, very recognizable, very heartbreaking way to love someone when you've lost access to your own emotional interior. Segment 7. The System as Therapeutic Structure. Let me offer you a reframe that I find genuinely illuminating. The system that Sung Jin Woo receives is often read as a game mechanic, a narrative device to justify the power fantasy, and it is that. But it's also structurally an external regulation system. Think about what the system does for Jinwoo psychologically. It provides structure, daily quests, clear objectives, immediate feedback. For someone whose inner world has gone quiet, external structure becomes the scaffold that daily functioning hangs on. It provides legible progress. You always know where you stand. There is no ambiguity. In a life defined by the arbitrary, lethal unfairness of dungeons and gates, the system is the one thing that behaves logically. It provides consequence without relationship. Failure means punishment, the penalty quests, but the system doesn't judge you. It doesn't withdraw warmth. It doesn't look at you differently. For someone with attachment disruption, this is safer than any human relationship. And critically, it provides purpose without demanding presence. You don't have to be emotionally available to level up. You just have to show up and perform. There's a modality in modern therapy called behavioral activation, often used in depression treatment, where the idea is that you restore functioning by building structured activity before the internal motivation exists. You act your way into feeling rather than waiting to feel before acting. The system is functionally compulsory behavioral activation. It keeps Jinwoo moving, engaged, and developing, and in doing so, it may be the only thing that prevented him from completely collapsing inward after the double dungeon. Which means the system is simultaneously the story's central fantasy and its most sophisticated psychological symbol. It saved him, and it also let him avoid himself. Segment 8. Is this the author's intent? A fair question to pause on. Is Chugong, the Manhwa's author, consciously writing a story about psychological dissociation? Almost certainly not, at least not in clinical terms. Solo leveling emerged from the Korean web novel tradition, where power fantasy and isekai-adjacent wish fulfillment are the dominant genre conventions. The story is, on its own declared terms, about a man becoming the strongest in the world. But authors know more than they know. The best fantasy and genre fiction operates as myth. It processes collective anxieties and psychological truths through the safe container of the fantastical. Readers respond to solo leveling with such intensity not just because the power fantasy is well executed, but because Jinwoo's particular flavor of strength, cold, driven, alone, self-sufficient to the point of isolation, resonates with something real. A lot of people know what it feels like to survive by going numb, to keep moving because stopping would mean feeling something you can't afford to feel yet. Jinwoo's story gives that experience a shape, an aesthetic, and, crucially, a form of dignity. That's not a small thing. Segment 9. The question. The story doesn't ask. Here is the tension that I think lives at the heart of solo leveling. and is never fully resolved. Jinwoo becomes, by the story's end, the most powerful being in existence. He achieves a level of strength that is, by definition, beyond relationship, beyond the reciprocal vulnerability that intimacy requires. He becomes essentially a monarch of solitude. The narrative frames this as victory. But there's a question lingering beneath the final frames that the story doesn't have the appetite to ask. What does Sung Jin Woo want when there's nothing left to fight? Because for someone whose entire psychological architecture was built around survival, around task completion, around converting threat into subordination, what happens in the absence of threat? What happens when there are no more quests, no more enemies, no more levels? The story's emotional resolution is Jinwoo's reunion with his family and the implied restoration of a normal life, and that's a satisfying ending on the level of plot. But a psychologist might note that being the strongest never actually addressed the original wound. The double dungeon didn't traumatize Jinwoo because he was weak. The trauma wasn't about power at all. It was about being in a world of arbitrary, lethal chaos with no control, surrounded by death he couldn't prevent. Becoming strong enough that nothing can threaten him is a response to that wound. But it's not a healing of it. There's a difference between invulnerability and recovery. One is the removal of future pain, the other is the integration of past pain. Solo leveling gives Jinwoo the former. The latter is left as an exercise for the reader. Sung Jin Woo is one of the most compelling power fantasy protagonists in contemporary manga and manhwa. Not despite his emotional flatness, because of it. His dissociation isn't a flaw in the characterization, it is the characterization. And whether or not the author intended it clinically, the text has produced something that functions as a remarkably coherent portrait of what surviving overwhelming trauma can look like when you have no space to process it, when the world keeps demanding you move forward and so you do. You go numb, you get strong, you make the dead kneel, and somewhere along the way, you forget what you were afraid of. Or maybe you just forget that forgetting was a choice you made. That's the psychology of Sung Jin Woo. Not a hero who conquered fear. A person who learned to live entirely in the space around it. If this kind of analysis interests you, where psychology meets fictional narrative, there's a lot more to explore on this channel. Next time, we're looking at another protagonist whose arc maps onto clinical theory in ways the genre hasn't fully reckoned with. Until then, take care of your inner world, even when the system tells you to keep leveling.